The tank destroyer sat at the crossroads like a dead giant, its hull blackened from yesterday's direct hit, but still intact enough to provide cover. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy studied it through the morning mist that clung to the Vosges Mountains, knowing that piece of American steel might be the only thing standing between his men and annihilation. The January cold bit through his wool overcoat as he crouched behind the stone wall of what had been a French bakery, watching German shadows move through the tree line 300 yards out. Staff Sergeant Coleman shifted beside him, wincing as shrapnel worked deeper into his leg. The medic had done what he could, but Coleman needed evacuation. They all knew it, and they all knew it wasn't happening anytime soon. The radio crackled with static as Stevens, their operator from Ohio, tried once again to raise battalion headquarters. Nothing but empty air and the distant rumble of enemy armor. "Sir, we've got maybe 12 effective rifles left," Coleman whispered, his voice tight with pain. "Battalion said to hold this junction, but they didn't say how long or with what." Murphy nodded, studying the terrain that would either save them or kill them. The crossroads controlled access to the village, and beyond that, the supply route for the entire 3rd Infantry Division's advance through the Vosges Mountains. Intelligence had warned of a German counterattack, but the reports spoke in vague terms, elements of enemy armor and undetermined infantry strength. What Murphy saw emerging from the forest was anything but undetermined. A full company of field-grey figures moving with the careful discipline of veterans, supported by at least one Panzer IV whose gun was already traversing toward their position. The smart, tactical choice was obvious: fall back through the village, use the buildings for cover, make the Germans pay for every street. But retreating meant leaving Coleman and 2 other wounded men who couldn't walk. It meant abandoning the crossroads that kept German armor away from American supply lines. Most of all, it meant accepting that some positions simply couldn't be held, no matter what the manual said about determination and firepower. Murphy felt the familiar tightness in his chest as the first German artillery rounds began falling in the distance, walking slowly toward their position. Fear was an old companion by now, as familiar as his M1 Garand or the weight of his field pack. But beneath the fear ran something else, a stubborn refusal to accept the mathematics of defeat that his men had learned to recognize and sometimes resent. They called it courage when they wrote the citations, but Murphy knew it felt more like an inability to live with himself if he made the safe choice. The Panzer's engine note changed as it downshifted, preparing to advance. Murphy could see the commander's head and shoulders in the turret hatch, probably a kid not much older than himself, following orders in a war none of them had started. The tank destroyer at the crossroads suddenly looked different, not just a piece of destroyed equipment, but a fighting position with thick armor and, if he remembered correctly, machine guns that might still function. "Stevens," Murphy called softly to the radio operator. "One more try to reach battalion. Tell them we're in contact and holding as ordered." But even as Stevens keyed the handset, Murphy was studying the 50 yards of open ground between their position and the tank destroyer, calculating angles and timing with the cold precision that had kept him alive through Sicily, Italy, and now the frozen forests of France. His men watched his face, reading the signs they'd learned to fear and follow in equal measure. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The German barrage lifted at exactly 06:30 hours, leaving behind a ringing silence that felt heavier than the explosions. Through the smoke and drifting snow, Murphy watched the enemy infantry begin their advance, not the wild charge of desperate men, but the measured bounds of professionals who knew their business. Behind them, the Panzer IV lurched forward, using a burned-out farmhouse as cover, while its machine gun raked the stone walls where Murphy's platoon waited. Private Martinez crouched 10 yards away, his useless left arm hanging in a makeshift sling, while his good hand gripped his rifle. The kid from New Mexico had taken shrapnel 2 days ago, but refused evacuation, claiming he could still shoot. Now he caught Murphy's eye and nodded toward the tank destroyer, understanding passing between them without words. They'd all seen Murphy make impossible calculations before, turning tactical disasters into narrow victories through sheer audacity. "Sir, that tank's got maybe 500 rounds for the main gun," Coleman whispered through gritted teeth. "But if Jerry gets close enough to use it, direct fire on our positions." He didn't need to finish. The stone walls that protected them from rifle fire would crumble like sand under high explosive shells. Murphy studied the advancing Germans, counting muzzle flashes and trying to estimate their strength. The Vosges Mountains had swallowed entire battalions in fighting just like this. Small unit actions where a dozen men held ground that should have required a company, where tactical manuals meant less than individual decisions made in seconds. The tank destroyer's hull showed multiple hits from yesterday's engagement, but its main structure appeared sound. More importantly, Murphy could see that its .50 caliber machine gun was still mounted and probably functional. From that position, he could cover the entire German advance while his men fell back to secondary positions. It was the kind of plan that looked elegant on paper and suicidal in practice. Stevens finally got through to battalion, the radio crackling with distant voices discussing grid coordinates and time schedules that bore little resemblance to the chaos unfolding in the frozen crossroads. Murphy listened to the mechanical language of command. Hold at all costs, reinforcements en route, mission essential to divisional objectives. The same phrases that had preceded every desperate stand from the beaches of Sicily to the hills above Anzio. "Battalion says help is coming," Stevens reported, but his voice carried no conviction. They'd all heard similar promises before, usually followed by hours of isolation, while staff officers revised their estimates and adjusted their plans. The panzer commander had spotted their position now, probably through binoculars, and was directing his gunner toward specific targets. Murphy watched the long barrel swing toward the bakery where his wounded waited, calculating time and distance with deadly precision. In 30 seconds, maybe less, that gun would speak, and the war would become very simple for anyone caught in its blast radius. Murphy checked his rifle one final time, feeling the familiar weight of the wooden stock against his shoulder. Around him, his men prepared for what they all recognized as a last stand, the kind that military historians would later describe in clean paragraphs about tactical necessity and battlefield courage. But for Murphy, crouched behind a stone wall in the Vosges Mountains, with German armor bearing down on wounded men who trusted him to make the right choice, history felt very immediate and personal. The tank destroyer waited at the crossroads like a steel monument to someone else's failed plan. In a few minutes, it might become his monument as well. The Panzer's first shot cratered the road 20 feet from the bakery, showering Murphy's position with frozen earth and stone fragments. The concussion left his ears ringing, but through the noise, he could hear Stevens frantically working the radio, trying to coordinate with adjacent units that might not even exist anymore. The 3rd Infantry Division's advance through the Vosges Mountains had stretched supply lines thin and left isolated pockets like Murphy's platoon to hold critical terrain with whatever they could scrape together. "Contact left," Martinez called out, his voice tight with pain and adrenaline. German infantry were working through the tree line, using the natural cover to advance within rifle range. Murphy counted at least 30 figures, probably more, moving with the patient professionalism of veterans who knew how to use ground and weather to their advantage. Coleman tried to shift position and nearly passed out from the effort. The medic had done what he could, but the staff sergeant needed surgery, not battlefield dressings. 2 other wounded men lay in the bakery's basement, conscious but unable to fight. Murphy felt the weight of their trust like a physical pressure in his chest, the expectation that he would find some way to turn desperate odds into survival. Through his binoculars, Murphy studied the tank destroyer one more time. Its armor showed scars from yesterday's engagement, but the fighting compartment appeared intact. More importantly, he could see ammunition boxes stacked beside the machine gun mount. Someone had died operating that weapon, but they'd left behind the tools for killing Germans, if anyone was crazy enough to use them. The radio suddenly came alive with voices from across the Vosges Mountains front. Other units reporting contact, calling for artillery support that wasn't available, requesting permission to withdraw from positions that couldn't be held. Murphy listened to the controlled desperation in officers' voices as they described tactical situations that existed only in the gap between what higher command expected and what small groups of exhausted infantrymen could actually accomplish. 3rd Battalion's pulling back from Hill 351, Stevens reported, his face pale in the morning light. Says they're down to effective squad strength. Murphy nodded, understanding the implications. If 3rd Battalion withdrew, his flank would be completely exposed. The German attack wasn't just probing for weak spots. It was a coordinated effort to collapse the entire American line in this sector of the Vosges Mountains. His dozen men at a forgotten crossroads had somehow become the hinge on which larger battles would turn. Private Jenkins, a replacement who joined them just before Christmas, crawled over from his position near the road. Blood seeped through a bandage on his forehead, but his eyes were steady. "Sir, that tank's moving again," he reported. "Looks like they're positioning for a final assault." Murphy watched the Panzer lumber forward, using the destroyed farmhouse as cover, while German infantry closed the distance. In 10 minutes, maybe less, they would be close enough for a coordinated attack that his reduced platoon couldn't possibly repel. The mathematics were brutally simple. Too many enemies, too little ammunition, too much open ground to defend. But the tank destroyer still waited at the crossroads, its machine gun pointing toward empty air. Murphy found himself calculating angles and distances with the cold precision that had kept him alive through 2 years of combat. 50 yards of open ground under direct fire, 30 seconds of exposure while he crossed the killing zone. Then if he reached the destroyer alive, a fighting position that could break up the German attack or at least buy time for his men to withdraw with their wounded. The plan violated every principle of small unit tactics he'd learned, but Murphy was beginning to understand that rules written in training camps rarely survived contact with reality in places like the Vosges Mountains. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The Panzer's engine roared as it broke cover, grinding forward over the frozen ground, while German infantry rose from concealment and began their assault. Murphy watched them advance in textbook fashion, bounds and overwatch, mutual support, the kind of coordinated attack that would overwhelm his handful of effective rifles in minutes. The tank destroyer at the crossroads suddenly seemed like the only sane choice in an impossible situation. "Cover me!" Murphy shouted to his men, then sprinted across the open ground before anyone could argue or try to stop him. German machine guns opened fire immediately, bullets cracking past his head and sparking off the frozen road surface. Murphy ran with the desperate speed of a man who understood that stopping meant dying, covering the 50 yards to the tank destroyer in bounds that would have impressed his drill instructors back in basic training. Behind him, he could hear his men laying down suppressing fire, their rifles barking in the disciplined rhythm he'd drilled into them during the long advance through the Vosges Mountains. The tank destroyer's hull was still warm from yesterday's fire, radiating heat that felt almost comforting in the January cold. Murphy rolled behind its armored bulk just as the Panzer's main gun spoke again, the high-explosive shell detonating where he'd been standing seconds before. Shrapnel rang against the destroyer's armor like deadly hail, but the American steel held. Murphy climbed onto the fighting deck and found what he'd hoped for. The .50 caliber machine gun was intact, with ammunition boxes stacked nearby. The previous crew had died at their posts, but they'd left behind a weapon that could still kill Germans if someone was willing to use it. The heavy machine gun commanded a perfect field of fire across the German advance. offering clear shots at infantry and even the panzer if its commander got careless. The German tank had closed to less than 100 yards now, its commander probably thinking the disabled American destroyer posed no threat. Murphy could see the man's head and shoulders in the turret hatch, young, focused, following his own orders in a war that had already lasted too long. For a moment, their eyes met across the battlefield, two soldiers recognizing each other across the artificial divisions of uniform and nationality. But recognition didn't stop Murphy from swinging the machine gun toward the advancing infantry. The .50 caliber weapon spoke with a voice like tearing canvas, its heavy rounds cutting through the German ranks with devastating effect. Men who had been advancing steadily suddenly scattered, seeking cover that didn't exist on the open ground between the forest and the crossroads. The panzer commander reacted quickly, traversing his main gun toward Murphy's position. But the tank destroyer's armor was designed to withstand direct fire, and the Germans' first shot only succeeded in rocking the hull without penetrating. Murphy kept the machine gun firing, working over the scattered infantry while the panzer maneuvered for a better angle. Through the gun smoke and winter haze, Murphy could see his own men withdrawing from the bakery, carrying Coleman and the other wounded towards safer positions in the village. That had been the real objective all along, buying time for evacuation, not winning some glorious last stand. The tank destroyer was simply a tool for keeping Germans at bay long enough for wounded Americans to reach cover. The panzer fired again, this time close enough to shower Murphy with concrete fragments from the road surface. But the German infantry attack had stalled completely, pinned down by machine gun fire from a position they'd thought was abandoned. Murphy could hear officers shouting orders in accented German, trying to reorganize an assault that had suddenly become much more complicated than anyone had planned. In the Vosges Mountains, Murphy was learning. Small actions could have large consequences, and individual decisions could reshape entire battles. What the after-action report would never capture was the moment Murphy's machine gun jammed, a double feed that left him exposed on the tank destroyer's deck while German infantry regrouped for another assault. The official citation would describe sustained automatic weapons fire against overwhelming enemy forces, but it couldn't convey the terror of frantically clearing a malfunction while a panzer's main gun traversed toward his position. Murphy's hands shook as he worked the machine gun's action, muscle memory from countless hours of weapons training guiding his fingers, while his mind processed the tactical situation with crystalline clarity. The German infantry had taken heavy casualties, but they were still combat effective. The panzer commander was learning to use his armor more aggressively, positioning for shots that even the tank destroyer's thick hide couldn't absorb. The real secret, the one that would haunt Murphy's dreams for decades afterward, was how close he came to running. For 30 seconds, while he fought to clear the jam, every instinct screamed at him to abandon the position and sprint back to his men. The tank destroyer suddenly felt like a steel coffin, and the mission, buying time for wounded men to reach safety, seemed less important than his own survival. But through the chaos, Murphy could hear Stevens on the radio, coordinating the evacuation of casualties from positions throughout their sector of the Vosges Mountains. Coleman's voice, weak but steady, directing the withdrawal of effective personnel. Martinez calling out targets and ammunition counts with professional calm despite his wounds. The sound of men doing their jobs under impossible circumstances, trusting that their lieutenant would do his. The machine gun's bolt slammed home with a metallic click that Murphy felt through his entire body. He swung the weapon back toward the German infantry just as they began their second assault, catching them in the open ground where tactical doctrine said they should have been safe. The .50 caliber rounds tore through their ranks with mechanical precision, each burst dropping figures that had been advancing with confident determination seconds before. The panzer commander made his mistake then, closing distance to support his infantry instead of maintaining standoff range for his main gun. Murphy watched the tank approach, calculating angles and distances with the cold mathematics that separated living soldiers from dead heroes. When the commander's hatch came within range, Murphy traversed the machine gun with deliberate precision. What happened next took less than 10 seconds, but would replay in Murphy's memory for the rest of his life. The young German tank commander, probably 19, maybe 20, looked up from his vision blocks and found himself staring directly into the muzzle of an American heavy machine gun at point-blank range. For a moment that stretched like eternity, two soldiers studied each other across the arbitrary lines of a war neither had chosen to start. The German raised his hands. Murphy held his fire, watching as the Panzer's crew bailed out with their hands visible, leaving behind a perfectly functional tank that would never again threaten American positions in the Vosges Mountains. The infantry attack collapsed completely without armor support, German soldiers melting back into the forest with the practical discretion of veterans who knew when to fight and when to preserve their strength for battles they might actually win. Stephen's voice crackled over the radio with news that reinforcements were finally approaching, a full company with armor support advancing through the village to secure the crossroads. Murphy remained at his position on the tank destroyer, covering the withdrawal of German wounded with the same professional detachment he'd shown their attack. War was ugly enough without adding unnecessary cruelty to its essential brutality. By the time the relief company reached the crossroads, Murphy was sitting on the tank destroyer's deck, sharing a cigarette with the German tank commander, whose name, he learned, was Klaus. They couldn't speak each other's language, but soldiers developed their own vocabulary of exhaustion and survival that transcended nationality. The young German kept staring at Murphy with something approaching disbelief, probably wondering how one American had stopped an entire assault with a supposedly disabled weapon. Colonel Peterson, the battalion commander, arrived an hour later to survey what intelligence reports would describe as a successful defensive action at grid coordinates 245.736. He studied the disabled Panzer, the scattered German equipment, and the handful of prisoners with the calculating eye of a staff officer who needed to transform battlefield chaos into clean paragraphs for higher command. "How many effective enemy casualties, Lieutenant?" Peterson asked, his clipboard already filled with preliminary numbers. Murphy considered the question carefully. In the Vosges Mountains, he'd learned that truth and official reports sometimes diverged in ways that mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. "Difficult to assess accurately, sir," he replied. "Enemy withdrew in good order after failing to achieve their objective. What he didn't report was the moment of recognition between himself and Klaus, or the way German medics had worked to save their wounded with the same desperate efficiency as American aid men. Those details wouldn't fit the narrative requirements of division headquarters, which needed clear victories and quantifiable achievements to justify the resources being expended in the frozen forests of eastern France. Coleman survived his wounds and returned to duty 6 weeks later, though he never moved quite the same way afterward. Martinez kept his damaged arm and learned to shoot left-handed, adapting with the practical resilience that separated veteran soldiers from the replacement depot statistics. Stevens became a sergeant and spent the rest of the war training radio operators, passing on hard-won knowledge about communication under fire. The tank destroyer at the crossroads was eventually repaired and returned to service, though Murphy never learned what happened to its new crew. Sometimes, late at night in quarters or foxholes, he would wonder about the men who had died at that weapon the day before his action, whether they had families waiting for letters that would never come, whether they had understood the tactical significance of the position they'd held until the end. 30 years later, sitting in a Texas diner with coffee growing cold in front of him, Murphy would read his grandson's history textbook and find 3 sentences about American defensive actions in the Vosges Mountains during January 1945. The text mentioned casualty figures and strategic outcomes, but nothing about the weight of individual decisions or the way courage felt from the inside when everything depended on one man's refusal to accept reasonable limitations. The real story, Murphy understood by then, was too complex for textbooks or after-action reports. It lived in the spaces between official language and personal memory, in the way a man learned to carry responsibility for choices that seemed impossible when he made them and inevitable when others retold them later. The tank destroyer at the crossroads had become a symbol in someone else's narrative, but Murphy remembered it as a steel shelter where he'd learned the difference between surviving a battle and living with its consequences. He never spoke about Klaus, or the moment when mercy became more important than victory. Some truths were too fragile for public consumption, too human for the machinery of legend that transformed wartime necessity into peacetime inspiration. The real weight of that January morning in the Vosges Mountains wasn't carried in citations or commendations, but in the quiet knowledge that courage and fear could coexist in the same moment, and that sometimes the hardest choice was knowing when not to pull the trigger. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.